Hello, everyone. We've added this note to the beginning of all of our original episodes of the podcast to let you know of a few changes that have happened around here and hopefully avoid any confusion for you as listeners. When we began this podcast, it was called Starseed Survival Guide, and most people called me, your host, by my birth name, Erin. Throughout the first 22 episodes, you'll hear me introduce myself as Erin, hear others refer to me as Erin, and hear many references to the name of the show being Starseed Survival Guide. In 2018, more and more folks began calling us Yaya, and in March of 2020, we changed the name of this podcast to Earthside Survival Guide to more accurately reflect our intentions for the show. For a little more of the full story of what these changes mean to us, please check out episode 23, a temple talk where we reflect on where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going. We thank you for your patience during this transition, for listening and sharing this journey with us, and most importantly, for allowing us to continue to grow and evolve. Blessings.
And as I call in the east, I walk into the stream, and as I call in the south, I bring water to my mouth, and as I call in the west, the creek swallows my chest, and as I call in the north, I am swallowed by her soul.
Hello, everyone. I'm here again today with culture maker, oracle, poet, educator, and author of the book Instructions to a Young Magician from Herself, Eve Bradford. Eve joined us back in 2017 as our guest for episode number 3, a really fun conversation titled Poet as Revolutionary and Sacred Whore. Welcome back, Eve.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
So, when we last spoke on the show, I knew you as a community member that had been continuously called upon to facilitate rites of passage rituals for others, and we didn't really touch on that aspect of your work last time. So I thought we would start off by asking, what kinds of rituals have you been asked to officiate for individuals and families so far on your journey? And why do you think it is that you're someone people naturally seek out in times of peak celebration and in times of personal chaos and loss?
Well, it's a really wide variety of things that people call upon me for. I sort of feel like I want to answer the second part of the question first, actually, because it feels like that's the beginning of the answer, which is, and it recalls to me this book that I read when I was in high school called Holy the Firm by Annie Dillard, which was like the first book that ever explained me to myself in this way that I had never thought to think of and had never seen anywhere, which it's a really amazing, very small, very dense book about, it starts with a story of a young woman who is severely burned in a plane crash. And she goes on to weave this incredible kind of extended metaphor of what it is to be skinless in the world. Like she begins with the actual biology and the medical information about what it means to not have your top layer of skin. And then she goes into this kind of archetypal exploration of these 3 archetypes that she calls the nun, the thinker, and the artist, as the 3 archetypes in the world who, through some combination of destiny and willingness and capacity, walk skinless in the world as a service, basically, to all of the rest of the people in the world who can't afford to live that way, because when you live that way, you can't really function normally as a person, because you have to be so sensitive and so vulnerable to the non-ordinary aspects of existence that then when it's time for people who are not living in that way to be able to access those ways of existing, they can come to you and access those places and those modes of being for a moment in a way that enriches their life and their experience in some important way, and then they can go back to their lives. And the only way that they can do that is through these archetypes who are willing to give their life entirely to that way of being. And when I read that, I was 15 or 16, I think. And I was like, oh, that's me. That's what I'm up to. And it's really given me a certain amount of clarity and purpose ever since, in like, this is what I'm doing. And it helps me understand my level of sensitivity in context of usefulness and service and purpose, rather than just feeling like blown about by. It's very empowering, basically. It makes sensitivity empowering because it's like, oh, this is why my experience is this way. And I can cultivate that and actually live into that way of being, because it kind of gave me a way to understand how it was functioning within the larger context of reality. And I think there's some way in which people can sense that. And I think it's more that than anything else is the real honest answer to that question, because people have always come to me for things way before I was ever anyone in particular, when I was quite young, And so I think there's a way that those of us who need those kinds of experiences can sense the people who might be able to offer an access point into that level of reality. And so then the things that are asked of me are a full range of all the reasons that someone might need to drop into a non-ordinary state of being, which might be a wedding. I mean, that's very, I've done a lot of weddings, including my own father's wedding, which was a total trip.
Wow.
But also just any kind of situation where someone needs a ritual way of navigating, which, as you said, can have to do with grief and loss, can have to do with death and dying, can have to do with just overwhelm and, other people who are extremely sensitive and don't know how to navigate it and are looking for a way to understand their own reality and existence. It kind of takes all of those different shapes and sizes. And something that's come into my life recently is the very daily ritual of tea ceremony, which is, for me, it's been in our community for quite some time now, but as a personal solo practice, it's pretty recent. And that's something that I've been sharing with people that's been really helpful on a level of like simple daily practice. That's so much. And then all of the work that I'm doing with Mogadao now and the Qigong, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but just the level of like, as opposed to a wedding, which is like a big one-time ceremony, which I love and is amazing to get to participate in, the cultivation of daily access into those non-ordinary states and the way that integrates into our being all the time is really what I find myself feeling the most drawn to now in this phase of life.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So over the past few years, I know that you personally have experienced major upheaval in your own world that ultimately landed you in a very different position within the web of life. Can you share with us about how you were living your life 2 years ago and the events that prompted this period of intense growth and transformation, and how you see these events propelling you to find a place of greater alignment to serve from?
Well, how I was living my life 2 years ago was very, very, very busy, very engaged in community leadership, working pretty consistently. A good part of my year was taken up between Lightning in a Bottle and Symbiosis festivals, curating content and designing ceremonial containers and facilitating ritual theater performances, all under Living Village Culture, which is a company that I co-founded with Isis and Gia. And it was a very full, very rich, very satisfying life in a lot of ways, as far as I could tell at the time. And then in 2017, a lot of really, as you said, profoundly challenging things occurred in succession. The two most significant of which was a massive, harsh falling out with my spiritual teacher of 10 years, Martine Prechtel, that was incredibly painful and traumatic in a lot of ways, and for whose teachings I still have a huge amount of love and respect and reverence for, though I don't have a ton of respect for how the challenge was handled. And that was, 10 years of dedicated study sort of crashing down around me, for which I don't absolve myself of all responsibility by any means. Like, I definitely participated in the experience, but it was definitely something that sort of felt like it was happening to me. And then in addition to that, I had a very strong connection with a young man who had a very intense asthma attack and basically died in my car while I was bringing him to the hospital. And it's a big story that I don't need to go into all the details of here, but he lost consciousness in my car while I was in the middle of a river canyon with him. And it was about 12 minutes from when he lost consciousness to when I actually got him to the hospital. And we had the same birthday and had recently become very, very close. And I felt like I was called into his life for this exact purpose of being in this death portal with him. And that was deeply initiatory and also profoundly traumatic, and was also my drive to town from home that I had to do every day. And so every time I drove to town, I was reliving that experience, and I needed to not do that for a little while. At that point, I was really pretty severely shaken up in a way that I didn't feel like I could explain to the people around me. It was just, there was no way to actually get across the space that I was in at that point. And it just so happened that there was an annual intensive that was being hosted here in New Mexico by a teacher that I had, on a whim, taken a one-day workshop with a couple of months earlier, because I saw the phrase, the erotic basis of being, on a flyer. And I was just, it spoke directly to my soul. And I went to this workshop knowing nothing about what it was about or what was happening, and was pretty blown away by the teacher, Zhen Dao, and the practices. I had sort of had it in the back of my mind that this intensive was happening. And then it just lined up with these occurrences where I was like, I just knew I needed to go. And so I went. And I started doing this very unique practice, lineage of practices that combine a very unique particular form of Qigong with hard Gong Fu and 5-element yoga and meditation and sexuality practices. And in that first week of ever doing it, I could feel the trauma leaving my body as I was doing it, particularly the Qigong. And so that was the first thing that was just profoundly amazing, that I could actually feel that happening. And then the other thing that happened kind of at the close of the week is that for about the past maybe year and a half, after a conversation with an elder where she kind of pointed out to me that I was an empath, which I didn't have the understanding of before she told me, and I've been kind of subtly sort of learning about what that meant. But basically what happened that week is that I came into my own field, I think probably for the first time in my life ever, where I actually really could sense a distinction between what was me and what was mine and what was not me and what was not mine, with a clarity that I had never had before. Which I now understand is because I was actually cultivating my own chi field. And so beginning to do that, it was like this fog got lifted from my vision. And suddenly I saw my whole life in this clarity of perspective that was really different than anything that I had seen before. And the two most sort of shocking and revelatory components of that was that I realized that I had completely confused meeting other people's needs with meeting my own needs, that I couldn't tell the difference between someone else's needs being met and my own needs being met. And then the other thing is that I had been identifying with other people's perceptions of who I was, because I couldn't tell the difference between other people's perceptions of who I was and who I actually am. And these are these aspects of being an empath that aren't cute and aren't romantic and aren't 10 signs you're an empath on a Facebook feed. It's really fucking challenging, actually, and can really make life not your life. Your life can be not your life, and you don't even know it. And it was really confronting because I think of myself as someone who, was pretty evolved and pretty intelligent, pretty perceptive about things. And it was really humbling to see the degree to which I had sort of gotten mixed up and turned around inside of my own life. And so I went back to my home in California and I did what I had to do in order to move to New Mexico to begin really studying these practices intensively because it was the only thing that made sense to me to do at that time. And I wasn't thinking much beyond like, this is what must happen. I wasn't really thinking about the implications of it beyond like, I'm just going to go for 3 months and see what happens. And so I did that last winter. I moved here for 3 months and lived alone for the first time in my entire life. I never lived alone before. And that was revelatory also. And just started practicing intensively and studying and training and dedicating myself to this work and these like just brilliant technologies. And started to heal, started to actually really heal myself and come into myself and become the person that I was born to be. And that process has continued. I had to leave for 3 months to go work on LIB. And then I moved back here in July and I've been here since then. And I've, within a month of moving here in July, I was offered a position to be on staff of the Mogadao Institute to become their director of outreach and to be a part of the think tank that kind of like shapes and determines the forms and the future and the direction of the Institute. And I received a first level of teacher training in November, which I'm continuing to do now because there's many levels of teacher certification within the tradition. And I have started working with individual clients, doing this really fascinating form of kind of Qigong oracular counseling that's just been organically growing out of people's genuine need, which is incredibly rewarding. And I love it so much. And it feels so good to be able to offer something to people that has changed my life and that I feel absolutely 100% confident will help. It's a really powerful thing to be able to offer and to move from. And I've continued to work with Living Village culture and to cultivate that work. It still feels relevant and important to me. And what's changed is me. What's changed is the place that I move from and how I'm living and how I'm understanding how I'm living and the choices I'm making and where those choices get made from. And I've noticed this season with LIB, it's been a very intense season. There were a lot of changes that happened, a venue shift and a date shift. And something that I noticed is that it never turned into stress. And it wasn't because I was actively trying to not have it turn into stress. It just didn't. Even when it was really intense and really like a lot, I never felt stressed. And that was very illuminating to me because it's very clear to me that that's because of my practice, because of the consistency of my practice, that experience enters me and moves in me differently than it used to. And that's really profound to see.
Mm-hmm. I've been searching lately for what language feels most accurate to describe a particular way of being that you might, you can say, okay, empath. So all the empaths out there that are in a place where they kind of maybe understand that you could embrace and cultivate that sensitivity as a path of service. Somehow with like inherent in that archetype to me is this idea of serving goddess in her form of as evolutionary creativity, and like that there is like a force that moves through, but it's not necessarily creativity that's like always going to be seen as immediately as constructive. And that I have been hearing from a number of people, different language like up-leveling or completing a cycle or what else? Even just like raising your vibration or ascension, like all this language could be used to describe the process of evolution, like where it is that you go in this evolutionary movement. Then I'm not quite sure like what feels best to me, but just to get us in the wheelhouse, when I talk to people that are really in that process consciously,
they're all saying in different ways, like, I don't know any other way. I wouldn't choose any other way, but this way really takes a toll on your heart. And they're actually talking about like their physical hearts. Like, I can think of maybe 4 different people that said this to me in the past like 2 weeks. And I feel that too, like a lot of physical sensation around my heart chakra, not like the muscle per se, all the time. So given that I do feel that you represent maybe just being like a little older, but represent the next octave of the thing that we're all doing. And I see you like settled in a really wonderful and supportive feeling, but fairly solitary home right now, and spending a lot of your time in practice and figuring out how to make your job be an extension of this practice. And so I'm always kind of looking further down the trail at some maps, and would just want to ask, like, how is your heart feeling these days?
My heart is feeling like shockingly better than it's ever felt in my entire life by leaps and bounds. One thing that happened when I went to that retreat last November, so a year and 4 months ago, is that I met a human being who I proceeded over the next several months to fall deeply in love with. And that aspect of my heart has been really like in a profound evolutionary process due to this relationship, which I've never been in a long-term committed monogamous relationship in the last like 15 years or something. And all of the long-term committed relationships that I have been in often had some dynamic that allowed me to stay pretty protected in terms of my heart, through choices that I made intentionally or unintentionally. And so what's interesting is that, in the practices that I'm in, we're working within a 5-element system, right? So, which is connected to TCM, to traditional Chinese medicine, but is sort of the Mogadao reorienting and revisioning of these things. So none of it is exactly conventional, but it does align with the 5-element creation cycle, which is wood, fire, earth, metal, water. And each of those are associated with an organ: wood with liver, fire with heart, earth with spleen, metal with lungs, and water with kidneys. And so fire is the realm of heart chi, right? That's where the heart chi is built and cultivated. And one of the primary ways that it's understood that heart chi is tonified, and also one of the ways that you can understand the relative health of your heart chi, is through the way that you relate to risk and risk taking. And that healthy risk taking tonifies heart chi. And the way that you relate to risk is a way that you can kind of track the relative health of your heart chi. And so in this really interesting way, one way to understand how that works on a practical daily, like what that actually looks like, is that the vulnerability that is absolutely foundationally necessary for any kind of healthy relationship to exist is exactly the kind of risk that tonifies heart chi. And so that's one of the reasons that I think we associate the heart with relationship and love, is because it's a risky business, and that risk is exactly the thing that actually, when it's done with mindfulness and with attentiveness, not out of control risk, that's false heart yang, is a way that we would understand like overly risky behavior. But that kind of healthy level of intentional risk taking, it actually strengthens our heart, like quite literally. And so that's something I feel like I've really been having a very firsthand experience of in this last year, because there was a moment when in this relationship, it got to the point where like I was in new territory and I was very uncomfortable and I wanted to run away. I kind of did for a moment. I was like, actually, never mind. This isn't what I came here to do. I came here to cultivate self-sovereignty, and I came here to actually come into myself for the first time in my life. Like, that's what I came here to do. And in that moment, it felt like that was mutually exclusive to being in a deeply partnered situation. And because of the incredible communication ability of this human, and I imagine some of my own communication ability as well, and willingness to stay in it, I chose eventually to actually lean into that riskiness and that vulnerability and to keep opening to that and to realize that actually as the heart chi becomes stronger, that one of the other realms of fire and the heart is self-expression. That's like where self-expression lives. So as you risk the vulnerability of an open heart, then your capacity for self-expression actually strengthens. It doesn't become compromised. And so by leaning in and risking the heart and risking vulnerability, my own self-sovereignty got stronger. It didn't get weaker, actually. It rose to meet the occasion. And that was a very profound learning for me, because somehow in my mind, I had been convinced, probably due to my own fear of actually being vulnerable, that somehow they couldn't coexist, that they were counter to each other. And I've found that that's actually not true.
Wow. Well, what a relief. Thank you for sharing the notes from the bleeding edge of reality. So I want to say to change directions a little here, but probably it'll all circle back into the center of the one spiral present moment. We have really loved being able to bring you in as a guest facilitator for our Medicine Mandala program, and having the opportunity to sit with you for a few days once a year. That's been super special. And I think just it's not that common for me anyway to really just be on the journey with someone where you get to witness the organic unfolding and evolution of their identity, vocabulary, offerings. And so we've always known that your technical and creative study of language is periodically placed in service of bringing forth oracular transmissions for communities in ritual settings. And it's a personal perspective that receiving oracular guidance from the land and ancestors has always been one of the major reasons that a community would gather in the first place. So I love that our folk are bringing that awareness back into gathering culture, making sure that the part where we listen to the transmission is not left out. And I'm wondering if you could share about how you discovered your ability to channel in this way and some of the different experiences you have had in this role that helped you learn to mediate and navigate between these different states of consciousness as part of your path of service.
Such an interesting question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. Good job. Yeah. I really have to give some credit and recognition to my longtime sister and collaborator, Isis Indria, in this department. Because I think she was the person who really pointed me out to myself in that way. And she had been working within a context of oracular framing of reality for quite some time. When we met, she started a series of gatherings in Seattle called the Oracle Gatherings. And so I think in a way, she recognized me as an oracle because she had that filter already on reality. And I think the way that it really became clear was because the way that we started working together was through making ritual theater performances together. That was our earliest collaborations, were in the form of theater pieces. And we were both coming from pretty different backgrounds in experimental theater, but we both had that as like a strong drive in what we were up to. And so we started doing these performances, and what just kind of would naturally happen is that, I guess because I was the talker, I was like the poet and the language person, I would be the narrator, and I would be the one person talking throughout the performance. And generally these things were just very magical and spontaneous and multidimensionally psychedelic, usually for events that both of us were also involved in producing. So it was never like a calm, extended rehearsal process. It was like, pull this thing together by the skin of our teeth. And so I never wrote what I was going to say. I would just drop in And basically what I was doing, without necessarily being conscious of the fact that this is what I was doing, is I would like connect psychically with the field of the people present for the performance and empty myself so that the language that needed to come through in order for them to be with us on the journey in the way that would allow them to actually receive what we were trying to create and offer would come through. And that's just what would happen again and again and again, to the point where like sometimes I would sit down to try to write something in advance and I actually couldn't, because it had become kind of specified to such a degree that it didn't make any sense to my consciousness to try to plan what I was going to say, because I didn't know what people needed to hear yet until I was actually in that moment. And so together, Isis and I kind of realized that something oracular was happening there. And then we went to Egypt together with a big group of people for the winter solstice of 2012 and kind of designed this oracular ritual that we did at sunrise the morning of the winter solstice 2012 between the paws of the Great Sphinx. And that developed into an annual oracular rite that we started doing every year on winter solstice, and who fulfilled the role of the oracle would shift. But the first one that we did back in California, I guess that would have been in 2013, I held the space of the community oracle for that ritual. And that was kind of, I think, the first time that I had done that outside of the context of a theater piece. But I feel like we had done so many theater pieces at that point that that was actually my training ground, was ritual theater. And it really speaks to the unique form of ritual theater, which is not just theater and not just ritual. It's really both. And the fact that it was my training ground as an oracle, I think, speaks directly to that. So that by the time I got to the point where I was actually like dropping in like the way that I did that, I was referencing my experience in the theater pieces most directly of anything else in terms of how that happened. And then since then, Isis and I have, for the past 3 years, have done this really incredible retreat called the Serpent Path Retreat. Its tagline is Practical Magic for Strange Times. And it's really a workshop in kind of the intersection of ritual practice and sacred activism and purpose work, and kind of developing personal practices that help one to locate themselves at the intersection of those things in their life so that they're able to live from that place. And so we do a lot of ritual as a part of this workshop. And traditionally Saturday night of the long weekend, we do a really in-depth Doth ritual, which is based on the Kabbalistic tree of life. Doth is she's kind of the 11th Sephiroth. She's like the mystery. And we do a ritual that's located within that sphere of the tree of life. And I hold an oracular space in that ritual, which Isis has developed these really beautiful ways of guiding me in and out of that space. And so the practice has grown by doing it, and each time it's a little bit different and each time it evolves. But there's some pretty clear transmissions that come through that it's definitely, it's deep, the thing that has really, I've learned so much from doing it, but that there really is, like, we have more access to what I think of as sort of like universal streams of sentient intelligence than we've ever been taught to trust that we have access to. And that I think oracular consciousness is really something that's available. It's not like someone is an oracle or not. I think there's people who have constitutions that lend themselves to it, for sure, but that it is a skill and a way of relating to consciousness and to reality that is absolutely available to be cultivated by anyone who feels called to cultivate that. I don't feel like it's specialized to a chosen few,
Mm-hmm. Many of the kava cultures that I've studied, it's not common knowledge if you just go to Fiji or Hawaii, but if you were to have the honor or privilege to access the writings of the Kava scholars on the island, there is a lot of information to suggest that originally those community rituals, which are now presided over by men, existed as menarche rituals to introduce women at the age where you would have your first blood, to use that as an opportunity to introduce them to their oracular capacity. So the belief that any menstruating woman could serve as an oracle for her community, that really deeply informs all of the ways that I work with women and women's health. So I love that you said that, just, as a reminder to whatever parts of ourselves might be listening that might kind of go like, oh, I think I remember being that or doing that. In my own oracular capacity, I think of myself as available to any angel, ally, ancestor of the light, or guide that wants to come through in service to the person. But most often what comes through is the grandmother's counsel. So sometimes someone's grandmother, or sometimes just a grandmother who is sympathetic to someone's condition for any number of reasons. And we understand that you primarily serve as a Lilith channel. And so would just love it, if you're willing, we would love to hear just why for you, you feel like listening to Lilith speak might be of particular importance for people in these times.
She's so glad that you asked. Yeah, I mean, it's no accident that being born as a person of pretty immense privilege with the name Eve, that it would be my job to give voice to Lilith. I've done a lot of work around unpacking and decolonizing that privilege that I was born into and the name that I was born with. And in the work that I've been doing and that Isis and I have been doing, Lilith has shown up as this embodiment of all the voices that have been written out of the story. All the voices that have been erased from history, that have had their voices stolen for one reason or another. The outsider, unacceptable, that archetype of being. She has just shown up so strongly in all of our work, just again and again and again, as the one that we are called to serve and to create a place for all the versions of her story and that story to be seen and heard and told. And, very personally, it feels like this very personal archetypal journey that Eve would make a place for Lilith to be seen and heard. For people who aren't familiar with the story, Lilith is understood in many kind of ancient pre-biblical traditions to be the so-called first wife of Adam. That can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different versions of the stories, but she was basically written out of the Hebrew Bible and demonized. And any place where you do see references to her, she's sort of because she wouldn't be submissive to the masculine. And then Eve was created as the sort of the one who would behave and would follow directions. So there's something on a very personal archetypal level that dynamic has occurred, which was never what I was thinking about as it was happening. In fact, I haven't ever talked about it as explicitly as I am right now, even to myself, but I'm seeing it very clearly in this moment, how real that is, and how, everything that I've been taught about utilizing the dominant conditioned consciousness to serve what it has been taught to dominate is one of the most radically kind of revolutionary things you can do, actually, is to put the dominant narrative in favor of the dominated narrative. However, you can do that in your life. And this is one of the ways that I've found to do that. And so her voice is often really real. She's not totally stoked about the state of affairs. Like, she has been abused and mistreated and mistold, and to be a mythical being, like, your whole existence is your story. And so when your story is stolen or mistold, it's like that's pain, that's starvation, that's abuse. That's how that is. And so as humans, one of the most powerful ways that we can serve these stories of power, these mythical, archetypal beings, is to tell their stories well, is to give ourselves to their stories and to the understanding and the cultivation and the research and the real, like, building of relations with their truth, and to be a vessel for that to find its way into the world in whatever way we were born to be a vessel. And so, my hope and my intention and my sincere wish is that the way that we work with her is a way of feeding her directly, and therefore feeding that entire range of beings who have been written out of the master narrative.
So well said. Just particularly resonating with me how you languaged when your stories are stolen or mistold. That's pain, that's starvation, that's abuse. Because I do think that we get caught in a duality where our pain is the truth and the other people are the cause of it. And we are being abused. Like everyone believes that they're the victim and they're just defending themselves. But I think I don't know. I would imagine that, like, many people could recognize that there's somewhere in their life where they're perpetuating a narrative about someone that they know on some level isn't true. So I feel like your statement, your definition of abuse could actually help a lot of people start to peel back that layer of vulnerability where you can see and you can admit, at least to yourself, like, we have become abusive to each other in this relationship, or I am a part of the cycle of victim and perpetrator, like, also. So thank you. So I guess I'm wanting to say for folks listening that just the term, like, oracle might be kind of abstract, but the idea of, like, changing your vibration or changing your state of consciousness might help to connect the dots of what we're talking about. Just many different cultures arrive at this state in different ways that I'm referring to as oracular. So many employ various medicines, and other cultures use ecstatic movement. Others work with this very universal technology of the drum and rhythm that, our new research has proven shifts your brain waves into a measurably different state of consciousness. And I had a feeling that you and I had maybe worked together in that way in some, past life. But I also had nervousness to explicitly request for you to show up for our apprenticeship group in that capacity this past winter, mainly because I was wanting to make sure that you felt adequately taken care of and safe and comfortable to go to that place of openness and vulnerability, really, in, this camping accommodations kind of situation that we have created. So glad that when you tuned in, that you with not really a lot of notice, that you did, like, what feels like take something of a risk to agree to bring it in that way. And I'm remembering that when we shared the space, you asked me to begin the proceedings by speaking our intention for requesting an audience with the goddess Bridget, as we were holding ritual on Bridget's day in bulk. And I shared simply that what has been passed down through history is not her complete story. And so we are the ones who want to know what the full story is and are here to make ourselves available to just hear directly from her what had been left out. So I love that, you just described, that's kind of your definition of the Lilith energy, is just kind of anything that's been left out. So I wanted to just ask, like, do you remember anything that was shared through you on that day?
I don't remember the specific language. I remember a little bit how it felt. Generally, when I'm in that space, it's like I'm not completely absent from what's happening, but it's like I'm in another room, kind of, or like behind a really thick piece of fabric. And so it's like I remember sensations, particularly of what it felt like going in and coming out. And I remember a sense of like, it definitely felt different than when I've worked with Lilith. Like the feeling of being in communion with Bridget was really different than the feeling of being in communion with Lilith, though not utterly dissimilar. I mean, there were definitely, it's interesting what you spoke to, because I actually don't remember you saying that. But the thing that felt the most similar between them was the sense of like, you guys are missing it. Like you're missing it. Not you specifically, like not the group of people who are there, but you as in like humans are like missing the boat. And this kind of sense of like loving us too much to hate us for it, but like just not impressed. Like that sense is very similar between both of them.
Yeah. So I didn't think to write it down. Sometimes I do. And sometimes someone in the space kind of gets that tapped to be the like mystical stenographer. But later I did sit down and try to recall my memory of what was said, thinking, that would actually be cool if maybe that transmission could be shared with the next larger sized group of people who are curious about these matters. So it definitely feels like, again, like I feel some nervousness to ask, but how would it feel to you if I read what I remembered of what you said?
Yeah, I mean, she wouldn't say it if she didn't want it to be shared,
I'm glad you feel that way too. The nervousness, though, especially comes from that, I'm sitting here like in some way face to face with you. And I do feel like it is a sort of ritual performance, ritual theater invitation for me, because I remember how it was said and I'm going to try to do justice. So I'm going to try to act out you channeling Bridget.
Amazing.
And you can just let me know, to be super honest, how that feels for you.
Did my voice change?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's something that people have told me happens a lot with Lilith. And then we've recorded some of them. And I've noticed that my voice is like quite different.
Yeah. So this feels okay for you?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Great. Thank you. All right. I'm going to take a breath here. And because I don't have your gravitas in general. And so I'm going to try to get in the vicinity. All right. And I guess I will say that how I feel, the importance of oracular learning to me is that for the oracle, they need to give their nervous system over to the goddess or the energy present as an instrument to be played, and their vocal cords. And then the listeners, you're hearing the words, but the words are just a menstruum that carries this ability for your nervous system to be like worked. And so it's like it's rather exhausting sometimes to be the one transmitting, but also to be the one receiving, to just feel like, oh, like that's something happened. So I have no idea if that will happen here or not, but just to say, like, it's a nervous system event when you're there in person, and there's usually some degree of waiting, like a doula for the event that there's something to happen that like may or may not happen on your timeline. So it's like a pregnant pause. The air is thick. Everybody is like, what's happening? Is this real? Like, how long are we going to sit here in silence? Are we supposed to be doing something? Did I miss an instruction? Like all of those kinds of feelings, like creating this building of discomfort. And then, so now you come knocking at my door. Well, at least you knocked. Not like the ones who came before with their burning brooms to set fire to my thatched roof. to set fire to the house of fire. Do you know what it's like to be marginalized, to be pushed into the margins? I think you do. Or you wouldn't be here. Everyone wants to be the one. The maiden with the candles in her hair. If you would be my daughter, then you need to make a place for me. Not just when it's easy. Yes, start where it's easy, but then do it when it's hard. Make a place for me. Not just in your home and in your heart, but in your world. And I will come. Until you make a place for me in your world, I can do no more. And of course, there was more in there, but that's what I remember that I can do justice to, that I feel has some accuracy of what was said.
Yeah. Hearing you speak it brings it back for sure. Interesting. It's a very real experience.
And something I really enjoyed about how that evening unfolded was that we kind of made an invitation for people who were tired from a full day of activities, that there was a time that they could leave. And then those who were like, I'm all in for however long this goes, that could commit to staying for the whole transmission, that stayed. And so it was a smaller group where we could have some more informal sharing and get to hear like how that landed for each person individually. That was kind of unique for me and really special. And and having people feel really comfortable, to be honest. And they were like, "Oh, this is kind of scary." I was like, "Oh shit!" Like, what is she gonna say? Like, and then it was fine. It was okay. It was just a call to action. It was just that, like, I am a goddess of action. Like, what are you going to do about it? It being perhaps your like desire to be of service or your devotion. One thing I wanted to add that we haven't spoken about was, walking home to my tent from the temple space alone in this sort of damp, cool, quiet night air. I just heard really clearly, like, her kind of one last thing. And what she said was, very emphatically, "I may perform miracles, but I am no saint."
Ah! Oh, yep. That sounds like her.
And it was so significant because we had been sharing about, and most of the like hardcore priestesses of Bridget of Kildare, like keepers of the flame at Kildare, mostly have made peace with that difference. Like, is it a goddess? Is she a saint? Is there a conflict with the Catholicism that mainly does keep all the points, like all the salient points of her personality? So it's kind of like, is it a problem? It's kind of peaceful and harmonious. And I was kind of there at the point of holding this ritual, was like, okay, at all the notes from the front line, like people who've given their life to this goddess seem to be saying like that synchronization with Catholicism have kept her stories alive better than most pagan goddesses. So like we can be okay with that. And yeah, we can be okay with that, but it was just cool and important for me to hear directly from her that she feels to call a goddess a saint is to significantly reduce the scope of her power.
Absolutely. Which, like, when I hear you say it, sounds absolutely true to me.
Yeah. So in the context of all of that specificity, because I could have just skipped that and just, did the interview, the normal interview. But with all that context, I'm curious to hear if you would describe, and maybe in a way like you were sharing in the first question, how reading that book introduced you to yourself because you recognized what they were talking about. You're like, this is me. This gives me a leg to stand on in like the world. Curious if you would describe what it feels like for you in your body, in your mind, in your nervous system to give your capacities over to another energy in general, and then specifically like that evening in that space. Like, what's the physiological, psychological impact?
It definitely has to do with getting empty. There's a phrase that I wrote in a poem a really long time ago, to be filled with the emptiness of offering. And that, I think, is a pretty accurate description of what the oracular state feels like to me. And so the process of going in is just putting down human personality, which for me happens to not be difficult to do. I think that's part of like why I kind of fell into this work in the first place, is because I'm actually not very attached to my human personality. And in fact, it generally feels really good to me to put it down. There's part of me that would prefer to sort of be that way all the time, actually. And I think there's a way in which the world of practice that I've moved into is sort of an aspect of that. I'm hanging out more and more in a place where I'm less and less in my human personality, actually. And that feels really good to me. So in a way, when I was talking about how, I think anyone who has this sincere and heartfelt desire can cultivate oracular consciousness, there are some constitutions that are sort of built for it. And one of the ways I think that my constitution is built for it is that it feels like a relief to me to empty myself. And like that sensitivity that I was talking about in the first question of like being skinless, and the way that in the day-to-day world as a human, that can be incredibly challenging and incredibly painful, or just overwhelming, or just, there's a lot of things it can be. And so there's this sense when I'm preparing to go into this oracular state, it's like, this is actually what that sensitivity is for.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that relief and that sense of calm that comes when you're doing exactly what you are uniquely built to do. And that only comes from that. And so there's this way in which when I'm, entering that state, it's like my whole being's just like, oh, yes, this is what we're made for, And it's never felt scary to me. It's never felt, In fact, one of the first times I did it, an elder of mine was present at that first solstice ritual, and she schooled me afterwards because she's like, you didn't even tether yourself to anything. She's like, I felt how far out you went. And she's like, just so you know, I tethered you to that buffalo skull right there. She kind of like scolded me. But, and I learned a lot from her, and I'm very appreciative. She's the same person who pointed out to me that I'm an empath. But, there's this way in which it's like, I didn't have that filter to be nervous about it because it feels so good to me. And I have since learned, more like proper techniques for making sure you come back, because that's the part that's hard, is actually, and you probably remember from that night, it's like, and this has happened, I know it happened the most at the Serpent Path retreat this year, there's this sense of like grief when I actually separate from her. And this happened with both Lilith and Bridget, where it's like, being out and empty and of service and just given over is ecstatic, actually. In a way, it's like the place where I am when that's happening is just sort of in this state of like ecstatic usefulness.
Mm-hmm.
And then to have to come out of that place and come back into being a human in a human body, having to figure it out for myself and not being able to just like given over to being useful, which is all I ever want to be, is useful to her. That's like been my prayer since I was so young, is just like, let me be of use to you. Mm-hmm. Let me be your vessel. And to be so close to the point where she's like speaking through me, and it's so easy. It's so blissfully easy. And then to have to let that go and to come back and to be separate from her again in a way where for a moment I got to not be separate from her. It's painful and it's filled with longing and grief in a way that is also ecstatic in its own way, but it's hard to come back. That's the hardest part.
Yeah. I mean, what you described that night and just now, that's how I always feel after sex. It's just like, there it was. And then now, and so I know that it's like the French called like merging in that way, like a little death. Then, I mean, they're speaking about orgasm, but I think that you could just take the orgasm out of it and just stay the merger. It is a death, and that it seems like there are just like, it's just a different orientation to life and death, where like there's the idea that there's an idea out there that people are afraid of death. I don't actually have that many people in my immediate sphere that are afraid of death, and I'm gonna like knock wood and like, just this is maybe just celebrate for the moment. But for the folks that are reported to be afraid of death, the idea of like giving yourself over or giving over control completely to something else, or dissolving your personality completely into like the infinite, they say is scary. But to me, like you're saying, like it's the most ecstatic communion and oneness and purpose and belonging and understanding and all is right with the world. And the coming back into the subjective personhood feels like the death. It feels like the end and the grieving. And so like life in the third dimension, though necessary, I believe, definitely that coming in and out, it's like this world that feels like the death or the half-life or the purgatory to me. And that other space that I feel like, well, this is me. This is what I am. And so it's interesting, like, I don't know, just to consider like being more identified with being an empty space than with being a person, though both are true and both are like, as you said earlier, accessible to all. So I really just deeply want to thank you for your willingness to speak openly about these ways of being that have been hidden and secret and underground for really good reasons for so many centuries. And I know that many people who have natural intuitive capacities are often unaware that the way they experience reality and the way that they've been told that makes them strange or even deficient is in fact an important prerequisite neurological difference. I just love how you have just articulated that so clearly. And I think just to kind of illuminate it. Well, we have to start wrapping up, but we would love to hear from you where people can connect with you to further explore your offerings.
Email is a really good way to get a hold of me. And my website is in the middle of a redesign, but there is still a page up that's a way for you to connect with me. And so that's ladyapples.com. And my email is simply eve@ladyapples.com. And I am really interested in connecting with people about the work that I'm doing now, and am open to potentially working privately with people, though there is a kind of evaluatory process to go through to embark upon that. But particularly for people who would find themselves listening to this podcast, I am really excited to be sharing this work with people. So if it does seem intriguing to you, please do feel free to reach out and initiate that conversation.
Wonderful. Formal thank you to you, Eve, and to all of the benevolent beings and all the realms who have gathered here today to inspire and direct the flow of this sacred energy exchange. We dedicate any merits accumulated through this work to the benefit of all sentient beings. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be well. May all beings know joy and not suffer. Jai Ma, Amen, Namaste, blessed be, Aho. It is finished in beauty.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can check out the first time we interviewed Eve back in episode 3, Poet as Revolutionary and Sacred Whore. We also have some bonus content available from Eve over on our Patreon page, which is www.patreon.com/activeculturefamily. We've asked Eve to read us a new piece of poetry, and if you're listening to this episode in real time, we're also giving away a free copy of Eve's book, Instructions to a Young Magician from Herself. In addition to helping us create new episodes of the podcast more regularly, the majority of the support we receive through our patrons goes directly into our scholarship fund that enables women of color of limited financial means to receive free or reduced price tuition to our educational programs and in-person trainings. In gratitude for your support and encouragement of this work, our Patreon page hosts lots of our own original content in the form of music, herbal dessert recipes, and other holistic healthcare guides that have been created with y'all in mind with so much love. And we really do hope that if you're feeling inspired after listening to this episode, that you'll take a moment to check it out. Blessings.
Love,